Hello, my name is Kristin Vayden. I'm a historical romance author for Sourcebooks. I am a traditionally published author, and I've also self-published and been published by an indie publishing house. So I've kind of done all the different ways, and it's a lot of fun. I'm very thankful to be able to write what I write. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about historical accuracy and research and how to get all of those puzzle pieces to fit together when you're writing your novel and your manuscript. There's three main points we'll go over today. The first one is know your sources. The second one is context is key. And the third one is don't be afraid. So as you use internet sources, what you want to make sure is that you're using something that's credible. Like, for example, if you go through a blog and you're like, oh, this blog is talking exactly about what I need to know about, and you go through it, at the very bottom, a lot of times there will be a source list where they gleaned all of their information in writing this article. And the wise thing to do would be to follow that trail. You always want to follow the trails. And if it goes to a reliable source, say it's coming from a museum in Britain, or it's coming from this historical reference that is completely credible, like it's the Cambridge Library, you know for certainty that that's fact, that's information that you can use, that you can base a whole story on, and someone's going to be able to go and find the trail where that came from. Now, sometimes those references, say you're reading, again, a blog, and at the bottom there's the sources, they'll reference another blog. So you go to that blog and you read through it and you're like, okay, well, where did they get their information? Then you find out they got their information from another blog. And there really is no credible trail that you can follow that allows you to say, yes, this is accurate, this is true. And then if you base an entire story or a subplot or a character based on that kind of information, sometimes that can really be a problem later on, because then you have to rewrite what you put into the story because it doesn't fit within context. And that is a huge issue for authors as we go through things, to be like, oh, I've made this whole situation and it's culturally or it's contextually or it's historically inaccurate. And that's a lot of work that you put into something that now you have to undo, and then you have to redo the right way. And it would be better if we could always do it right the first way. So we want to go back and really consider our sources, making sure that they're coming from credible places, making sure that the people we're relying on to give us information have gotten their information from credible places. And that allows us to really foster a healthy relationship of trust with our readers as well, because then they know what they're reading is something that could have actually happened in that era for historical accuracy. The next key is context. Context is key. Context is huge, especially when you're doing anything historical, because everything in the world that you are building, because you are building a world, it's not just known, it's not a contemporary novel. It's not something that's just understood by culture as they read it. It's something you have to put into context for your readers so that they understand not only the physical setting around the book, but also what culturally is happening at that time and is acceptable or unacceptable, however it plays into your novel. So context is very important, and it's really important to get correctly, because if you don't, again, it can undermine the integrity of your story, which is, again, the last thing you want to do when you put all your effort into this book. So the first thing you want to do is build your world. Anybody who's written a historical novel will tell you it's world building, right? It's not the same as a sci-fi. You're not completely building an entirely fantasy world, right? You are building something that's historically been present at some time, and now you're re-representing it, which means you have to re-represent it accurately and well and do justice to the era that it was in, which means a lot of research, which is, again, back to our first point, why it's really important to study your sources. Two, now that you're in context and you've studied your sources, put them in place in a way that does justice to the historical era. So, for example, there is nothing wrong with looking for images that help you physically picture yourself in that era. So as you're building your world and you're setting up the scenery and you're setting up the setting for your characters, there's nothing wrong with going and saying, what does so-and-so place look like? What does Stirling Castle actually look like? Do a virtual tour. There is so many wonderful things that can come from going and doing a virtual tour and allowing yourself the opportunity to place yourself in that context. So one of the ways that I've done that is I have had the blessing of being able to be at Hyde Park in London. And, you know, it wasn't what I thought it was in my head. It wasn't a beautiful, lush, birds chirping type park. It was very big, and sometimes the grass really didn't grow that beautifully, and the path kind of wound along this way, and there was a lot of tree roots in the way that you could trip over, and the serpentine wasn't as glamorous as I kind of thought it was. And so with that, I was able to weave those elements into stories with accuracy, saying, hey, I know that this and this looks this way, and so I'm going to portray it this way, which gives it a historical accuracy based on the context of the setting. It's also wise to research what things looked like at that time. So for example, the Thames River. If you were to put into context, or if I were to put into context into the story saying, oh, the beautiful Thames, then anybody who's lived in London and done their historical research would be like, the Thames is kind of muddy. And it is, and it kind of has been for a really long time. So I'm going to show that I didn't do my research by just even putting a poor description in the world building of my context and of my story. Don't be afraid. Point number 3. There's a lot of things that can go right and go wrong with historical accuracy, but that should never stop you from asking the questions and from doing the research and finding out if it's a possibility. And you know what? Worst comes to worst, you can always ask. I don't know how many times I've had to ask questions about things that I thought would be an easy find on the internet or in my research books, and there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing because no one had asked the question before. And so I thankfully had editors I could reach out to and various Facebook groups who studied that specific era of time and who had a lot more of an idea than I do in that context. And so don't be afraid at the daunting prospect of historical accuracy and just say, okay, well, I'm just going to do contemporary. No. Historical romance novels are so much fun, and there is nothing like them in the world. I feel like the whole rave around Bridgerton is proof. There is nothing like a good Regency, and there's nothing like a good historical novel. They're bar none. However, they can take a lot more work than just something that's contemporary because of all the research involved. But don't let that make you afraid or feel like it's daunting. It really isn't. It's something you can throw your whole self into, and you find so many interesting things that I've loved to research. So don't be afraid. Find resources, whether it's on Facebook, and then you can ask those sources. Say there's a Facebook group that I'm a part of that's a lot of Jane Austen fans. And they have huge parties and they get together and they have a lot of historical facts that they share within the group. And if there's certain things that I kind of were wondering about, like for example, well, can you give me a rundown of the exact Regency dress from top to bottom just so I understand it in context? They can give me a picture of all of their clothing set aside and say, okay, this is this, and this is this, and this is what they would wear here, and this is the mop cap, and this is what their slippers looked like. And it's a lot more of a visual for me. And that's super helpful since I'm a visual learner. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to go and find research. And don't be afraid to reach out to other people and other authors and ask them questions. I have a wonderful group of authors that I'm constantly being like, hey, what do you think about this? And it's really helpful. And lastly, if worst comes to worst and you've done all of your research and you have tried to figure out everything for context and you know your sources are accurate and you still can't find anything and you've asked all the right questions, do the best you can and make it up as you go. Because after all, it's fiction. It's historically accurate fiction, but it's fiction. And there's nothing wrong with writing your own story. And so do the best you can. Say, hey, I've done all the research. This is what I think it's going to be as close as possible, and write your story. Because if you can't figure out the answer and you've done the research, chances are no one else really knows for sure what it would be correctly as well. And so have fun with it. That's all what this is all about. Writing is fun. So to conclude our time, we'll just go over our 3 points, which were know your sources, keep it in context, and don't be afraid. I want to thank Latoya and Our House Literary for having me here and for inviting me to talk about all of this. And I want to invite you guys to find me on social media. I am everywhere, and you can find me on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook on Kristin Vayden. And don't forget to check out Fortune Favors the Duke.